I never thought my life could feel so quiet, so ordinary, as I sat on the edge of my small wooden porch, sipping the warm tea I had brewed just moments ago, watching the sun dip below the horizon and paint the sky in bruised shades of violet and gold. The crickets began their soft evening chorus, and the faint rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze made the world feel alive yet safe, as though nothing extraordinary could touch the fragile calm I had carved out for myself. But even in the stillness I sensed a tension I couldn't name. A flicker at the edge of my vision that made my skin prickle with curiosity and caution. My home was modest but cozy, the air rich with the scent of herbs drying in the kitchen, the walls lined with worn books whose spines bore silent witness to years of whispered secrets and quiet dreams. Yet the quiet beauty of the evening felt layered, almost as if the world around me held more than it revealed, and I could feel it pressing gently against the edges of my awareness, a subtle pulse of something beyond the ordinary. I watched a flock of birds wheel across the fading sky, their wings slicing through the twilight as I tried to convince myself that life was simple, predictable, that tomorrow would be just like today, but the hairs along the nape of my neck stood on end, and I could not shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me from the shadows beyond the garden's edge. That's when I first saw him, though I did not yet know his name. A movement so fluid, so silent, that it could have been a trick of the light, or perhaps the result of my own restless imagination. But when my gaze landed on the slight glint of a red eye among the branches of the tall oak at the boundary of my yard, my heart skipped, and a shiver ran down my spine, not from fear exactly, but from the undeniable sense that the presence belonged to something far more dangerous and enigmatic than I had ever encountered. He was Kael, though I did not know him as such yet, the rogue wolf of secrets, a shadow lurking just beyond the ordinary world I had built around myself, his figure blending with the night like ink spilling into water, impossibly dark and impossibly strong, yet patient, almost as if he were waiting for me to notice, waiting for me to understand that my life was about to shift in ways I could not predict. I tried to steady my breathing, convincing myself it was a trick of the fading light, but the feeling of being observed lingered, subtle and insistent, weaving itself into the rhythm of the evening, making the soft chirping of insects sound like a chorus carrying messages I could not yet translate, making the wind through the pines feel like fingers brushing against my senses, hinting at something alive and sentient just beyond sight. My dog, a small and curious creature named Finn, sat beside me, ears twitching toward the darkened treeline, growling softly at nothing, yet I could see his fur bristling, and instinctively I knew that he felt the same thing I did, that there was a presence patient and silent, holding itself just beyond comprehension, and I found myself wondering if it had always been there, watching, or if it had only appeared in this moment, summoned perhaps by the shifting tides of the world I thought I understood. I took another sip of tea, the warmth a small comfort against the rising tension curling through my chest, and tried to ignore the feeling that the ordinary world I knew, the soft safety of my home, the rhythm of familiar routines, the quiet heartbeats of evening, was only a thin veneer stretched over something deeper, something that could not be tamed or contained, a pulse of destiny I was only beginning to sense. Even as I set the cup down on the worn wooden railing, I felt my eyes drawn again to the shadows beneath the oak, to the faint glimmer of red that pulsed like a heartbeat, and a thought, strange and unbidden, crossed my mind, that the world had layers I could not yet see, and that some truths required patience, observation, and courage to perceive, truths that could not be explained with logic alone. A flock of fireflies rose from the grass, weaving through the twilight with their tiny glowing bodies, and for a brief moment, the red eye vanished, leaving only the soft, ordinary glow of the evening. I exhaled slowly, willing my pulse to calm, yet the sensation lingered as if Kael's gaze had carved a small, invisible mark upon my awareness, a quiet reminder that I was no longer entirely alone in this space, that someone or something had stepped into my life in a way that could not be ignored. And in that subtle, suspended moment, just before darkness claimed the sky completely, I felt a shiver of anticipation, the faint pull of destiny brushing against the edges of my soul, whispering that the life I thought I knew was about to unravel into something far greater, far more complex, and entirely beyond my control, and somewhere beyond the treeline, in the shifting shadows where the night thickened and secrets thrived, Kael waited, patient, silent, and impossibly close, a presence both terrifying and fascinating, leaving me with the smallest, most persistent thought. My ordinary world had already begun to change, and I would never be the same. The next morning, the world felt slightly altered. as though the familiar rhythms of my small life had been stretched and refracted through some invisible prism I couldn't name, and even the sunlight filtering through the trees carried a different weight, sharper and more insistent, making the shadows beneath the pines seem deeper and more secretive than usual. I walked along the garden path, my bare feet brushing the dew-laden grass, and noticed how the wind seemed to whisper with intent, stirring the leaves in patterns that felt deliberate, almost like a language I was not yet fluent in, while my heart thumped with a strange anticipation, a sense that something unseen had shifted the axis of my ordinary day into an unfamiliar alignment, and I wondered if I was imagining it, if the tension threading through my senses was born of excitement or warning. The small animals that normally scurried about greeted me with unusual stillness, their eyes flicking toward the treeline before vanishing into the underbrush, and I realized that the forest around my home had become almost sentient, aware, alive in ways that defied reason, and I found myself pausing more frequently, listening to the subtle cadence of the world, feeling as if each whisper of wind, each rustle of leaves, carried a hidden message meant for someone who was learning to pay attention. And then I saw him, though only for a heartbeat, before he melted into shadow again. Kael, the rogue wolf of secrets, crouched low among the dense branches at the edge of the clearing, his muscular form almost invisible in the dappled light, the left eye glowing faintly like molten ruby, watching with a patience that unsettled and fascinated me at the same time. He did not move toward me, did not signal, but there was an undeniable impression left in his presence, a subtle mark upon the air, that made my pulse quicken and my mind reel with questions I could not yet answer. A quiet insistence that the ordinary world I trusted was only a thin veneer, hiding forces I had barely begun to understand. I felt a shiver as I stepped further into the clearing, and a sudden surge of emotion washed over me, an unexplainable wave of longing and urgency that seemed to flow from the very earth beneath my feet, as if the trees, the soil, and even the fading light of the morning had conspired to deliver a message in feelings rather than words, a message I could sense but could not yet translate, leaving a hollowness of anticipation that was both thrilling and alarming. At the edge of the garden, I noticed the broken twig, bent in an odd angle, and a faint paw print pressed into the soft dirt that had not been there the day before, small but deliberate, and I knew immediately, without reasoning why, that Kael had been here, leaving his quiet signature behind like a ghost's reminder that events were shifting, that the world was preparing me for change I could not yet fully perceive. As I bent to examine it, the wind carried a faint sound, the low, deliberate rustle of leaves that almost resembled a word, and my breath caught, a subtle recognition stirring deep within my chest that some presence, silent, powerful, patient, was watching and guiding, unseen yet undeniably real, orchestrating events with a hand I could not yet see but could somehow feel threading through the day. I continued my walk toward the forest's edge, where the canopy darkened and the shadows grew long, feeling an inexplicable pull that urged me to move closer, to test the boundary between my ordinary life and the hidden world pressing in on it. Each step felt heavier, yet infused with a strange vitality, as if the forest itself were breathing around me, alive with energy that vibrated beneath my skin, and I sensed that the balance of what I knew, and what I had yet to discover was shifting with every heartbeat. Then came a fleeting moment of clarity, the glimpse of Kael's silhouette slipping between trees, fluid and silent, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the faint glow of his red eye flickering in memory, like a beacon signaling that the ordinary rules no longer applied, that the subtle currents beneath life were steering me toward something I could not yet name. A sudden rustle of wind and a cascade of falling leaves brushed against my face, carrying a scent of damp earth and something darker, deeper, older, and I realized that I had never truly walked alone in this world, that the quiet safety I had assumed was an illusion, and that Kael, patient and enigmatic, had already begun to shape the path before me, nudging me forward in ways I did not yet understand. The forest seemed to exhale, as if confirming this truth, and I felt a tremor of excitement tinged with unease pulse through my chest. There was a rhythm to the day that was no longer mine alone, a subtle orchestration that hinted at destiny, mystery, and choices waiting just beyond my vision. By the time I returned to the porch, the sun had shifted low, brushing the horizon with molten amber and violet, and I caught a last, faint flicker of red in the distance. Kael's eye lingering behind the trees, patient, silent, unyielding, and I knew, without understanding how, that I had already stepped into a world that would not let me go, a world where ordinary days would vanish, replaced by something dangerous, enthralling, and inexorably entwined with the shadow of the rogue wolf of Secrets. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the breeze wash over me, and in the hush of twilight, I felt the first stirrings of destiny pressing close, whispering a promise I could not yet hear clearly, leaving my mind brimming with questions and my heart poised on the edge of the unknown, wondering how much of this change I could survive, how much I would embrace, and whether the silent guardian watching from the shadows had already decided my fate, or merely invited me to discover it for myself. The first time I saw him, the air seemed to shift, heavier yet electric, as though the forest itself had paused to acknowledge his presence, and I realized in that moment that ordinary life had no claim over the space he entered. He stood at the edge of the clearing, tall and composed, his presence magnetic, a quiet authority radiating in every measured movement, the kind of gravity that made the birds hold their song mid-flight and the wind seemed to bend around him, drawing my gaze as if the world itself insisted I notice. His eyes, dark and impossibly deep, held a storm I wanted to understand, a mixture of strength, curiosity, and an unspoken sorrow that tugged at something buried in my chest, leaving me breathless in a way I had never experienced in the mundane days of my quiet life, and even before he spoke, I felt the weight of his attention, deliberate, piercing, and entirely unyielding. I wanted to move closer, compelled by some instinct deeper than reason, yet I hesitated, sensing that his calm exterior hid more than strength, that he carried secrets the forest itself seemed hesitant to whisper aloud, and in the same instant, from the shadows along the tree-line, Kael appeared, silent as smoke, his muscular form blending perfectly with the darkness, the red glow of his left eye flickering faintly as he shifted to observe, and I felt the familiar thrill of tension threading through my spine, the sense that someone or something was watching me from beyond perception, measuring my reactions with patience that felt almost predatory. The newcomer's gaze flicked briefly in my direction, and for a heartbeat, it felt as if the forest and I were suspended between breaths, every leaf, every blade of grass, every shadow holding its own secret, the air vibrating with anticipation I could neither name nor resist. He stepped forward just enough to enter the clearing, and the subtle scent of him reached me, something earthy, sharp and unfamiliar, like the promise of rain over parched earth, stirring an urgent curiosity that I had spent my life suppressing in favor of safety and routine, yet now rose inside me unbidden, demanding that I pay attention. Kael moved slightly along the edge of the clearing, silent and deliberate, and though he did not speak aloud, his presence carried a weight that pressed against the back of my mind, a sense that the rogue wolf of secrets had recognized something important in this moment, something that I could not yet fully grasp, and then, soft and almost too quiet to be heard over the wind in the pines, I caught the words he murmured, low and deliberate, vibrating with meaning. "Your alpha isn't who you think. He is." The phrase sent a shiver down my spine, though I had no understanding of its implications, and I glanced instinctively toward the alpha figure, the one whose calm and magnetic presence now seemed layered with mystery, wondering if Kael's warning applied to him, or to something far larger than myself could yet perceive. I wanted to ask questions, to demand clarity, yet the newcomer's aura held me still, a paradox of safety and danger, as if every inch of his being contained a secret I was not meant to unravel too quickly, and I understood immediately that this was not someone to approach lightly, that the unfolding of his story would intertwine with mine in ways that could not be escaped once begun. Every subtle movement he made, every tilt of his head, every quiet exhale of breath seemed measured and deliberate, and I felt my own heartbeat synchronize with the rhythm of his presence, a strange and unsettling connection forming across the space between us, drawing me forward without words, without promise, but with undeniable force. Kael's eye flickered again, a brief ember in the dark, and I sensed an approval, a recognition that this connection, whatever it meant, was significant to the balance of things I had barely begun to comprehend. The rogue wolf had always been my unseen guide, my silent sentinel, and now his cryptic warning hung in the air, echoing in the spaces between trees, between heartbeats, suggesting that the alpha figure before me carried more than strength. He carried destiny, mystery, and a force that could alter the course of my life entirely if I allowed it. I watched as the newcomer extended a hand toward a fallen branch and lifted it with a grace that seemed effortless, observing the clearing as if measuring every detail, every subtle shift in light or shadow, and I felt a flicker of envy at his apparent command over the world, even as I sensed the precariousness hidden beneath his composed exterior, an unspoken tension threading through his posture, an invisible tether to truths yet unspoken. Kael's presence at the edge of the clearing was unwavering, his red eye fixed on the newcomer and me simultaneously, a reminder that the shadows held their own power, and that what was unseen could often shape outcomes far more than what was visible. The rogue wolf of secrets was there not to intervene but to mark significance, and I felt the weight of that marking deep in my chest. A pulse of intuition and forewarning that demanded I remain alert, that demanded I recognize the stakes of this encounter before understanding them fully. As the sun dipped lower, brushing the canopy with amber and violet, the newcomer turned slightly, his gaze catching mine again, a silent acknowledgement that he had noticed me as well, and in that fleeting connection, I felt a shift in my world, a subtle trembling of the ordinary that suggested that nothing would ever be the same, that even the quietest corners of my life were now vulnerable to forces larger than I could yet comprehend. Kael's red eye flared once more briefly, as if punctuating the moment, and though no words were spoken, the energy of the forest, the newcomer, and the silent rogue wolf combined into a tangible tension that pressed against my senses, leaving me poised on the brink of discovery, fear, and curiosity all at once. I felt my breath hitch, my pulse quicken, and a low thrill surged through me, the kind that told me the story of my life had just taken its first irreversible turn, and the final thought lingering as shadows lengthened across the clearing was simple and insistent. Someone or something was about to change everything, and Kael, patient and enigmatic, would be watching every step I took. His cryptic warning echoing in my mind and ensuring that I could not ignore the truth shimmering just beneath the surface of the ordinary world I had clung to for so long. The morning after the encounter, I awoke with the taste of something unfamiliar on my tongue, a faint metallic tang that lingered long after I had rubbed the sleep from my eyes, and though I tried to convince myself it was merely the residue of a vivid dream, the images burned behind my eyelids too clearly to dismiss. A forest stretched infinitely under a blood-red moon, shadows that moved against the natural order, and always Kael. His massive form silent and unyielding, his glowing red eye fixed on me as though holding some unspoken counsel I could not yet decipher, a presence both protective and enigmatic, warning without speaking, guiding without revealing, and when I finally forced myself to rise from bed, the ordinary world I had taken for granted, the kitchen filled with sunlight, the soft clatter of dishes, the hum of distant traffic, already felt fragile, as if the threads holding it together were quivering in anticipation of something vast and unknowable. I poured tea and tried to steady my mind, but the scent of pine and damp earth that clung to the breeze reminded me too clearly that the forest outside had changed, or perhaps that I was seeing it differently, noticing patterns in the wind and the sway of leaves that had always been there but had gone unseen until now, and I felt a pulse of energy under my skin, a thrumming that seemed to echo the heartbeat of something larger, something waiting. And the ordinary life I thought I knew began to unravel in subtle, unnerving ways. Every encounter that day carried an odd weight. The mail carrier paused longer than usual, looking toward the trees as though sensing something I could not yet define. A cat brushed against my legs with a sharp, knowing look in its eyes, and even the neighbors, usually indifferent and mundane, seemed to move with a slight hesitation, an almost imperceptible awareness of events beyond our comprehension, leaving me with the growing certainty that the world had shifted, that my perception had shifted, and that these were not coincidences but signs threaded through reality with deliberate intent, all carrying the same unspoken question. Was I ready to see the truth? Kael's presence, though invisible to everyone else, made itself known in small deliberate ways. The snap of a twig behind a bush, a shadow that lingered just a fraction too long, the faint glimmer of red reflected in the dew on a stone, each subtle signal pressing against my consciousness like a pulse reminding me that the rogue wolf of secrets was watching, assessing, and perhaps guiding, and though I did not yet know what he sought to warn me of, the insistence of his presence gnawed at the edges of my understanding, a silent insistence that the ordinary rules no longer applied. That evening, as the sun dipped low, spilling molten gold through the windows, a sudden surge of emotion overtook me, unprovoked but undeniable. Longing and fear intertwined with curiosity and a strange exhilaration, each heartbeat echoing with a resonance I could not place, as if the forest, the wind, and the shadows themselves were communicating a truth I was only beginning to sense, a reality where ordinary days could shift into extraordinary nights with the slightest touch, the smallest sign, and Kael's silent guidance was the only tether I had to navigate this new current. The events of the day coalesced into a series of small but unshakable coincidences. A note slipped under my door with only a strange symbol I had never seen before, the scent of pine and something musky lingering long after I had closed the windows, a distant howl that did not belong to any known creature in the area, and in each instance I felt Kael's eyes on me, the rogue wolf moving just beyond perception, leaving markers like breadcrumbs for a mind alert enough to notice, and I understood that these signals were meant to prepare me, to awaken awareness, to guide me toward choices that would define the path I had yet to walk. Night fell quickly, heavier than usual, pressing against the roof and windows with a presence that seemed almost alive, and sleep became an uncertain threshold, each moment a delicate balancing act between the ordinary world I had known and the shadowed one that had begun to insinuate itself into my life. In my dreams, the forest stretched wider than reality could hold, the moon hung larger and redder than the sun would ever allow, and Kael appeared repeatedly, sometimes crouched and silent, sometimes moving with impossible swiftness through the darkness, always watching, always leaving a sense of anticipation, and always delivering messages I could not fully decode. A subtle shift of the wind, the twitch of his ear, a glance in a direction where nothing seemed to exist, each moment carrying the weight of something vital though unnamed. By morning, the ordinary walls of my home felt smaller, constricting, and even the familiar scent of herbs and tea seemed infused with the energy of change. I stepped outside, the dew cold against my skin, and the forest beyond shimmered with subtle anomalies, patterns in the light and shadow, sounds that did not belong, movements that felt deliberate, and I realized, with a mixture of awe and fear, that my life as I had known, it was no longer the reference point for understanding reality. Kael appeared one last time that morning, crouched among the branches of the oak tree at the edge of my garden, his glowing red eye catching the early light, and I felt it was less a warning and more a confirmation. I could no longer ignore the currents beneath life, the threads that intertwined destiny, mystery, and forces I had barely begun to perceive, and in that moment clarity struck me fully for the first time, sharp and inescapable. The ordinary world I had trusted, the patterns I had relied upon, and the safety I had assumed were illusions, and everything, every choice, every heartbeat, every glance toward the shadows, would now carry the weight of a reality I had only just begun to glimpse, a reality in which Kael, patient and enigmatic, would continue to watch, to guide, and to leave subtle warnings that would push me, gently yet irresistibly, toward a truth that could change everything I had ever believed. The days that followed carried a rhythm both strange and magnetic, a cadence that pulled me toward him even when our words were few and deliberate, each conversation threaded with subtleties I had never learned to read, yet somehow understood instinctively, as if the forest itself lent me insight into the spaces between his gestures, the slight lift of an eyebrow, the way his hand hovered over the edge of a table before retreating, all of it communicating volumes without sound, and I realized that connection was forming not through what was said but through what remained unsaid, the silent understanding that grew heavier with each shared glance and quiet laugh, a tension that was neither threatening nor comfortable, but utterly compelling. Kael, as always, remained in the periphery, a dark silhouette among the trees or along the forest's edge, his glowing red eye flashing like a warning and a guide simultaneously, and though he never approached, I could sense his attention weighing on the moments between us, nudging me to notice subtleties I might have otherwise ignored, small signs in the environment, the pattern of leaves on a branch, the way the wind shifted as if carrying a message just for me. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the canopy and painted dappled patterns across the clearing, he approached with a quiet deliberation, the tension in his posture softening slightly when he caught my gaze, and I felt the pull in my chest, a mixture of trust and caution, relief and exhilaration, all entwined, a knot that I could neither untangle nor resist. He spoke then, his voice low and steady, not commanding but confident, asking questions about my life, my past, even my quiet moments of solitude, and each word carried a weight, a sense of curiosity that felt protective, the kind of interest that allowed room for me to be myself while drawing me closer, deeper into understanding him. And I realized that in these moments I was learning more about strength, patience, and vulnerability than any ordinary day had ever allowed. I noticed Kael shift in the shadows as if responding to the subtle increase in our closeness, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial, leaving marks in the dirt at the edge of the clearing that seemed like signs, like messages meant to remind me that the bond forming between us was being observed, monitored, and shaped by forces beyond my perception, and that every heartbeat, every glance, and every tentative smile was part of a larger pattern I could not yet fully understand. As the light shifted toward evening, I caught him looking at me in a way that made the air itself feel charged, a connection that thrummed with unspoken promise and tension, and I realized that this bond, however tentative or untested, had already begun to alter my perception of the world. The ordinary rhythm of my life, so carefully maintained, had been replaced by awareness, attentiveness, and a sense that nothing I had known before would prepare me for what was coming. Kael's presence was never far, sometimes in the corner of my vision, sometimes just a glimmer of red amidst the dark, and each time I sensed him, it was as though he were guiding the unseen currents of our interactions, a silent observer ensuring that our connection strengthened in ways that were necessary, though I could not yet name why, and I began to understand that his cryptic guidance was part of the unseen structure of the world I was stepping into. A framework of destiny, trust, and subtle influence that only those attuned could feel. That evening, as we walked along the edge of the forest, the conversation drifted from trivial matters to the unspoken fears and hopes that lingered at the edges of our hearts, the words soft but deliberate, each sentence a careful thread weaving an emotional tapestry between us, and I felt a rare clarity in the understanding that connection could be felt as much in shared silences as in spoken thought, that the spaces between words often carried the deepest truths. I laughed softly at a small anecdote he shared, the sound more unguarded than it had been in years, and I felt him relax slightly beside me, the tension easing from his posture, the warmth of trust settling like sunlight between the two of us. In the quiet, Kael's shadow passed briefly along the trail ahead. A subtle signal that I noticed without meaning to, and I understood that the rogue wolf of secrets had acknowledged this growth, that the bond forming was important not just to me, but to the balance of forces beyond our immediate perception, and his red eye seemed to glimmer like approval or perhaps a silent caution, a reminder that connection could be both a strength and a vulnerability, that the depth of feeling carried weight beyond the simple act of recognition. The forest seemed to breathe with us, the wind carrying soft scents of pine and earth, the light fading in streaks of gold and lavender, and in that moment, I realized that I had never experienced anything like this. A pull toward someone that felt both natural and fated, compelling and fragile, and I understood that emotional bonds could shift reality itself, that the heart's attentiveness could reveal truths and dangers alike, and that this closeness, tender and exhilarating, was a hinge upon which everything might turn. And then as twilight deepened and shadows stretched long across the clearing, he paused, looking down at the earth and brushing a finger over a fallen leaf, and for a heartbeat, our eyes met in silence that carried more meaning than any words could convey, a recognition of trust, curiosity, and unspoken alignment, and just as I opened my mouth to respond, I heard Kael's voice, low and deliberate, threading through the still air, almost like a ghost whisper. Not all who seem close are what they appear. And the words, though brief, struck me with their weight, and I realized, with sudden clarity that sent my heart hammering and my mind spinning, that the bond we had been nurturing so carefully and delicately was not only significant in its own right, but also a hinge upon which unknown truths and tests would turn, that the connection itself might reveal hidden motives, secrets yet unseen, and that every tender gesture and shared glance was part of a larger tapestry I had only begun to glimpse, a design in which Kael, silent and enigmatic, held knowledge I could not yet access but would be forced to reckon with sooner than I expected, leaving me stunned and breathless as the forest exhaled around us and the last streaks of daylight disappeared into shadow, carrying the understanding that my life, my choices, and my heart had already changed in ways I could not reverse. The night air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine as I wandered the forest's edge, the moon spilling silver across the path, and I felt the familiar hum of tension threading through every nerve in my body, a quiet alertness that I had grown accustomed to since Kael first appeared, and yet tonight it was sharper, more insistent, as though the shadows themselves carried secrets that could no longer be deferred. I followed the faint path lined with fallen leaves, each step sending a whisper through the silence, and sensed Kael before I saw him, crouched low atop a rock, red eye glowing like a lantern in the darkness, watching me with patience that felt almost alive, as though he had been waiting for this very moment, for the precise alignment of circumstance that would reveal truths too long hidden. I paused at the clearing where the moonlight pooled thickest, and there, etched into the earth in faint, almost imperceptible patterns, were symbols I did not recognize, a tapestry of lines and curves that felt older than memory, older than the pack itself, and though I could not read them, I felt their meaning pulse beneath my fingers, a rhythm that resonated with the deepest parts of my being, stirring a blend of awe, fear, and anticipation. Kael's presence was no longer just an observer, but a guide, a silent interpreter of the language of shadows, and I sensed his intent as strongly as if he had spoken aloud, to prepare me for revelation, to draw me closer to truths that could not be ignored. The wind shifted, carrying the soft rustle of leaves like whispers, and I realized that the forest itself seemed to respond, bending light and shadow in ways that highlighted the patterns beneath my feet, as though encouraging me to trace them, to feel their resonance, to acknowledge the existence of forces I had never dared imagine, and in that realization a chill ran down my spine. My life, my ordinary world, had been poised on the edge of something far greater than I had known, and I could sense that every choice I had made, every glance, every interaction, had been subtly guided toward this very juncture. Kael moved silently along the edge of the clearing, his presence both comforting and unnerving, and though he did not speak, the weight of his observation pressed against my consciousness, carrying the unspoken message that the answers I sought were not given freely, that I would have to earn understanding through attention, courage, and discernment. I realized then that the rogue wolf of secrets had been shaping my awareness all along, nudging me toward observation and reflection, preparing me for truths that would alter not only how I viewed the world, but also the people I trusted and the path I would be asked to walk. And then I saw him, the Alpha, the one whose presence had drawn me inexorably toward connection and curiosity, standing just beyond the outer circle of light, watching me with eyes that mirrored a storm I had glimpsed before. Yet tonight there was a depth, a shadow behind the gaze that I could not ignore, a quiet admission of secrets held too long, of burdens carried silently, and my pulse quickened as I realized that the bonds I had felt growing between us were entwined with destinies and mysteries far larger than either of us alone could comprehend. Kael shifted again, his red eye flaring briefly as though punctuating an unseen truth, and in the quiet moment that followed, I felt the resonance of a hidden prophecy vibrating through the clearing, a ripple in the night air that threaded through the trees and into my chest, leaving a physical imprint of inevitability, and I understood, suddenly and sharply, that the Alpha's intentions, the purpose of the tests I had sensed but not yet experienced, and the very currents of the Pack's future, were entwined with forces I could neither name nor fully grasp, yet could feel, a tapestry of destiny unfolding around us with deliberate, inexorable precision. My eyes caught the faintest movement behind him, a shadow detaching from the larger darkness, and for a heartbeat I thought it was the wind, until Kael emerged fully, fluid and deliberate, stepping into a glade just beyond the Alpha, his presence marking a boundary between revelation and action, a silent warning that what I was about to witness would change everything I thought I knew. And then, as if drawn by instinct or fate, the Alpha lifted his hand toward the ground, revealing an object, partially buried in the earth, glinting faintly in the moonlight. A talisman I recognized instinctively as older than memory, etched with symbols that mirrored those on the clearing floor, humming with energy that prickled my skin and forced my knees to buckle slightly, leaving me breathless as understanding surged through me. The forest seemed to exhale, carrying the weight of knowledge in every rustle of leaves, and I realized that the talisman was not merely an artifact, but a key, a signal that the threads of my life, the Pack's future, and the hidden purpose Kael had been guiding me toward were converging, and that the Alpha's true role, far from the ordinary figure I had perceived, was tied to destinies and secrets older than anyone had dared speak aloud. The revelation struck me with such force that I staggered back, clutching my chest, and the wind carried Kael's silent warning like a whisper against my ear. Not everything is as it appears, and the path you follow now will decide more than you can imagine. My vision blurred briefly, the moonlight flickering against the talisman's surface as the forest seemed to shiver, and in that moment I understood, with a clarity that both terrified and exhilarated me, that the ordinary world I had known, the quiet life I had cherished, and even the bonds I had formed in safety were illusions compared to the magnitude of forces now revealed, and that my choices, my attentiveness, and my courage would determine whether the secrets now laid bare would protect or consume us, whether destiny would be fulfilled or shattered. As the Alpha stepped back, his gaze meeting mine with unspoken intensity, I felt a weight settle across my shoulders, a responsibility I had not expected yet could not escape, and I realized that the rogue wolf of secrets had been preparing me for this moment all along, guiding me toward awareness with cryptic signs, silent observations, and subtle nudges, and that my perception of loyalty, strength, and truth would never be the same. The final shock came not in words, not in movement, but in the sudden, undeniable recognition that the talisman, the Alpha and Kael were bound to a single truth I had never imagined, that the very pack I had believed I knew, the ordinary threads of my world, and even the bond one thought we had been nurturing, were all part of a story far larger, older, and more dangerous than I had ever believed possible, and that my life, my understanding, and the choices I would be forced to make from this moment on had irrevocably changed, leaving me standing in the moonlit clearing, heart pounding, mind racing, and eyes wide with the awareness that nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed the revelation were unlike anything I had experienced, as though the very air I breathed had grown heavy with expectation, each moment threaded with a tension I could neither ignore nor fully understand, and I felt my world wobbling beneath me, the once familiar rhythms of life now uncertain, unstable, as if the forest, the wind, and the shadows themselves had conspired to pull me into a reality where choices carried weight far beyond my comprehension. Every interaction became layered with meaning I could not name, the Alpha's presence a constant yet enigmatic force, his glances calculated, his words measured, revealing fragments of intent while leaving the rest shrouded in mystery, and I found myself questioning even the simplest decisions, wondering whether loyalty, trust, and courage were sufficient shields against the currents now sweeping through my life. Kael appeared as he always did from the periphery, a shadow among the trees, his glowing red eye catching the sunlight only briefly before vanishing, a signal more felt than seen, a presence that carried warning and guidance in equal measure, and though he never touched the events directly, every subtle movement of his, every mark left in the forest floor, every pause in the wind seemed to push me toward awareness, heightening the sense that the world had become a chessboard, and I was learning, perhaps too late, that even a single misstep could tip the balance in unforeseen ways. The forest itself seemed to respond to my uncertainty, the branches trembling with a strange cadence, the wind carrying whispers that echoed like distant voices, and I realized that the ordinary stability I had relied on, sunrise and sunset, the quiet hum of life, was gone, replaced by a current of unpredictability that demanded vigilance, courage, and clarity, and each small choice I made now reverberated through the web of events in ways I could feel but not yet comprehend. The Alpha tested me with subtle challenges, small requests that seemed mundane but were layered with hidden consequences, and I could sense, even without understanding why, that each trial was designed not only to measure skill but to probe my perception, my intuition, and my resolve, preparing me for events that were yet to unfold. Kael's presence became sharper, more insistent, a red eye that lingered on the edge of my vision, his movements almost theatrical in their silence, marking corners of the forest where unseen tensions pulsed strongest, where decisions could create rifts or open paths, and I felt the weight of his scrutiny like a hand pressing lightly but unrelentingly on my shoulder, reminding me that awareness alone would not be enough. I would have to act, and every act would carry consequences beyond the ordinary. A single choice came suddenly, unexpectedly. The Alpha requested I accompany him to the eastern ridge, a place where the forest deepened into shadow and light mingled in strange, deceptive patterns, and I felt a rush of both fear and anticipation, knowing instinctively that this was not merely a walk but a test, a threshold I was being asked to cross, and I hesitated, aware that hesitation itself could carry cost. Kael appeared at the edge of the path just as I stepped forward, his body coiled like a shadow ready to spring, his red eye flaring in the waning light, and I sensed his warning, that the decision to follow would open doors that could not be closed, that the path was fraught with uncertainty, and that my instincts, my attention, and my courage would be the only guides I could trust. Yet there was also a subtle promise in his presence, a suggestion that the journey would reveal truths I needed to see, and that while danger and instability lurked, clarity and understanding might also emerge if I remained vigilant. As we moved toward the ridge, the forest shifted around us, shadows lengthening and folding in ways that seemed almost deliberate, as though the landscape itself were alive with intent, and I felt the pull of destiny threading through every step, a current that seemed both external and internal, tugging at my thoughts, emotions, and awareness, challenging me to remain steady, to notice, to interpret, and to act with precision, for the consequences of misjudgment were no longer hypothetical. They would shape the course of events to come. At one point, a sudden sound, a branch snapping under unseen weight, sent a shiver through me, and Kael's presence flared in the corner of my vision, a silent signal that something was shifting, that the world was testing the limits of perception and courage simultaneously, and I realized that the instability I felt was not merely circumstance, but a reflection of the forces converging upon me, a crucible designed to reveal character and preparedness, and that the Alpha's subtle orchestration of these events was part of a larger plan whose edges I could sense but not yet define. The ridge loomed ahead, a dark line against the fading light, and the path narrowed, forcing a focus I had not needed before, every footfall deliberate, every breath conscious, every glance counting, and the forest's rhythm became a backdrop to an internal dialogue of fear, curiosity, and growing resolve. I sensed Kael's red eye flare once more, a punctuation against the darkening sky, and in that flare, I felt both warning and encouragement, a message that my next choice would shape not only the immediate moment but the unfolding of secrets, bonds, and revelations yet unseen. As we reached the crest of the ridge, the forest falling away to reveal a valley shrouded in mist, I understood fully for the first time the instability threading through my life. The ordinary world I had once trusted was gone, replaced by a reality where perception, intuition, and courage dictated survival, where bonds were tested not through violence but through awareness, where every glance, every gesture, and every unspoken word held significance beyond the surface of events. And I realized that the choice to follow the Alpha here was not trivial. It was a pivot, a turning point, a step into a realm where secrets, destiny, and truth would collide. In that moment, I made my decision, heart pounding, breath steadying as I acknowledged the weight of the world shifting beneath me, and as the mist thickened around the valley below, I felt Kael's presence beside me for the briefest instant, a silent acknowledgement, a reminder, and a nudge that the path I had chosen would test me in ways I could not yet foresee, that the stakes had risen, and that the unstable world I now inhabited demanded attention, courage, and trust, for the story was only beginning, and the consequences of inaction or misjudgment would be far greater than I could yet imagine. The ridge had settled into silence as twilight bled across the valley, leaving shadows stretched long and trembling like living things, and I found myself seated on a fallen log, knees drawn close, as the weight of the days since the revelation pressed against me, a quiet ache that demanded reflection, a sense that the world I had stepped into was not only unfamiliar but layered with histories and truths I could barely glimpse. The Alpha sat a few paces away, his posture relaxed yet deliberately measured, eyes fixed on the mist curling through the valley below, and for the first time I noticed the lines etched in his features, subtle traces of hardship, loss, and choices made long before I had crossed the forest threshold. A story written not in words but in the quiet gravity of his presence, the way his hands rested on his knees, the slight dip of his shoulders under burdens invisible to all but the most attentive observer. Kael lingered beyond the trees, his red eye a faint glow in the gathering dark, and though he did not approach, I felt him as a pulse, a rhythm threaded into the forest itself, a silent witness to the unfolding revelations, and I understood that his presence was not merely observational but connective, linking the layers of past and present, shadow and truth, in a web I was only beginning to perceive. The Alpha's voice, low and steady, finally broke the quiet, carrying with it the weight of years unspoken, as he recounted fragments of his early days leading the pack, the mistakes that had cost trust, and the small victories that had earned it back, and I listened with a mix of awe and empathy, sensing that the magnetic presence I had felt was tempered by every choice, every sacrifice, every quiet, unacknowledged loss he had endured, and that his strength was forged not only in physical power, but in emotional resilience, patience, and an unrelenting sense of responsibility that stretched beyond the immediate pack to the threads of destiny and secrets, now intersecting my own life. I shared, in turn, pieces of my story, moments of solitude, small griefs, and flickers of courage that had gone unnoticed in the ordinary world, and in the Alpha's attentive silence, I felt the first tangible recognition of connection, the understanding that our shared experiences, though separated by circumstance, were linked by the same undercurrents of challenge, hope, and vulnerability, the same forces Kael had silently guided me to notice, that had shaped my attention and awareness without explicit instruction, and I realized that this bond, delicate, deliberate, and emotionally intricate, was being observed and subtly influenced by a presence older and more aware than either of us could articulate. As the mist shifted, forming shapes that seemed almost purposeful in the moonlight, Kael's figure moved closer to the edge of the clearing, muscles coiled and attentive, glowing red eye fixed not only on me but on the Alpha, and I felt an almost imperceptible tension surge between shadow and light, a reminder that while the past we were unearthing carried meaning, there were layers of danger, loyalty, and hidden agendas that had yet to reveal themselves fully. and that each confession, each moment of vulnerability, was part of a larger pattern only Kael seemed able to read. I noticed then the way the Alpha's gaze lingered on me with something beyond curiosity, a blend of trust, assessment, and guarded hope, as if he too recognized the unseen threads that Kael marked in the periphery, that destiny and choice were intertwined, and that every emotion revealed, every memory, every fear, every flicker of courage, carried consequences beyond our immediate perception, shaping not only the bond between us but the path forward for the pack, and the hidden currents that bound us to forces older than our understanding. The night deepened, stars trembling above the canopy, and a hush fell over the forest, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves, the low sigh of the wind, and the distant call of creatures unseen, each sound threading through the space between us like a delicate signal, a punctuation in the ongoing story of revelation and trust. And I realized with a mixture of fear and exhilaration that the emotional truths being uncovered were as potent as any physical test, that awareness of the heart, of history, of vulnerability, could shift outcomes in ways far more subtle and permanent than strength or skill alone. Kael's shadow shifted again, crossing the clearing in a smooth, deliberate motion, and I caught the faintest glint of his red eye, a silent warning that even as the stories of our pasts unfolded, there were secrets yet unspoken, prophecies yet incomplete, and choices yet to be tested, and that the deeper our understanding grew, the more fragile and unstable the balance became, threading suspense into every glance, every breath, every pause in the conversation. And then, just as I began to feel the weight of understanding settle into a careful rhythm, the Alpha reached into his cloak and withdrew a small folded note, edges worn and ink faded, and handed it to me without a word. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded it, revealing a message written in a script older than any I had seen, carrying a name I knew only in whispers, a lineage I had believed lost, and a truth that struck me like lightning. The histories of my own family, intertwined with the pack, with the Alpha, and with the unseen forces Kael had guided me to notice, were far more entwined than I had ever imagined, and in that instant, the quiet of the night and the stillness of the forest were shattered by the realization that my own life, my choices, and my heart were now a fulcrum on which the past, present, and future balanced precariously, leaving me breathless, unsteady, and acutely aware that every secret uncovered only revealed another layer deeper than I could yet fathom, and that the path forward would demand courage, clarity, and a willingness to confront truths I had not known I was ready to face. The dawn broke over the ridge with an uneasy hush, the mist clinging stubbornly to the valley below as though reluctant to reveal what had been hidden through the night, and I felt the tension settle over my shoulders like a cloak, heavy and unyielding, each breath a reminder that the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty, and that trust, fragile, precious, and easily shattered, would be tested with relentless precision. The Alpha moved with deliberate calm beside me, but I could sense the careful calculation in every measured step, the subtle weighing of choices, the silent expectation that I would respond correctly to situations I could not fully predict, and the forest itself seemed to pulse with a quiet warning, the shadows stretching long and swaying with a rhythm that felt almost like intent, as though the trees themselves whispered secrets meant only for those attuned enough to notice. Kael appeared briefly in the corner of my vision, a flash of shadow and the unmistakable glow of his red eye, then vanished as silently as he had come, leaving behind a subtle marker, a slight disturbance in the leaves, the faint impression of claws along the soft earth, that suggested observation, caution, or perhaps a signal of what was to come, and I felt the familiar mixture of reassurance and unease that accompanied his cryptic presence, knowing instinctively that his guidance would shape my decisions even when I could not decipher the meaning fully. The Alpha led me through the forest with minimal explanation, the path narrowing into dense undergrowth and twisted roots that demanded careful attention, and each challenge, though seemingly simple, identifying a faint scent, noticing the irregular flight of a bird, interpreting the subtle changes in light and shadow, was layered with intention, as if every observation, every hesitation, and every correct or incorrect response was part of a larger pattern designed to test more than skill. It tested awareness, intuition, patience, and trust, and I realized that even a single misstep could ripple outward, creating consequences beyond my immediate understanding. I stumbled briefly over a gnarled root, and the Alpha's hand reached toward me, not touching but offering the silent acknowledgement that the moment had been noted, a gesture carrying both reassurance and expectation, and I felt the weight of responsibility press down with renewed intensity, that the connection we were building was under scrutiny not only by each other but by unseen forces, currents that Kael had long since been aware of and subtly prepared me to navigate. A sudden crack of a branch in the distance drew my gaze, and Kael's presence flared like a signal, his red eye catching the faintest glimmer of dawn before retreating once more into shadow, and I understood without words that this was a warning, a reminder that the challenges ahead were neither hypothetical nor forgiving, and that I needed to maintain vigilance, to interpret every detail, and to act with precision, for even minor oversights could tip the balance in ways unseen. As the morning deepened, the forest seemed to close around us, the light filtering in fractured and fleeting, and I felt the strain of uncertainty weighing on the Alpha as well. Though he spoke little, the tension in his posture, the measured tilt of his head, the almost imperceptible narrowing of his gaze, revealed that the stakes were escalating, that the tests were growing more exacting, and that the fragility of trust and hope could be measured in moments as easily as in hours. Kael's movements remained fluid and deliberate, tracing patterns along the edge of the clearing, leaving subtle hints and observations in places I could see only if I looked carefully, like a hidden map of caution woven into the natural world. And I realized with a jolt that his guidance had been cumulative, layering over days and nights, preparing me for this escalation, ensuring that even when the forest seemed uncertain and the Alpha's expectations opaque, I would be guided by instincts. Sharpened under his watchful, cryptic eye, the tension coiled tighter as the morning wore on, each pause filled with unspoken challenges, the forest alive with the energy of testing, and I felt hope dimming slightly, as though the clarity and warmth I had once felt in our growing bond were being tempered by the weight of scrutiny, by the persistent reminder that the world I inhabited had rules I was only beginning to perceive, and that survival, understanding, and connection demanded more than intention. They demanded perception and action in tandem. Suddenly, the path split sharply, revealing two routes that both seemed possible yet carried subtle differences in light, scent, and sound, and I knew instinctively that this choice was deliberate, that the Alpha was testing more than decision-making, testing intuition, trust in instinct and our connection. Kael appeared briefly atop a distant boulder, his red eye flashing as though punctuating the moment, a cryptic message that the correct path was not obvious, and that the wrong choice could separate us from clarity, from opportunity, or from understanding. And I realized the forest had become a mirror of the tension threading through my own mind. Uncertainty reflected in every leaf, every shadow, every sound. The Alpha's gaze met mine across the fork, a silent question in the curve of his lips, the tilt of his head, and I hesitated, knowing that my choice carried weight far beyond the immediate path, that it would echo through unseen layers of destiny, trust, and consequence. And yet, even as I moved toward one side, a sudden rush of wind, a swirl of leaves, and the unmistakable flash of Kael's red eye reminded me that even correct decisions would be tempered by forces beyond our comprehension, and that observation, patience, and attentiveness were as vital as courage. As we progressed, the forest thickened, shadows folding over one another, and I felt the tension rising like a tangible pressure, a sense that the world itself had grown unstable, that hope, trust, and certainty were fragile threads stretched to breaking, and that each heartbeat, each glance, and each silent decision carried significance, shaping outcomes that were both immediate and far-reaching. The Alpha's movements became more deliberate, his attention sharper, his words fewer, and I realized that the testing was escalating into something far more demanding than I had imagined, that the emotional and intuitive challenges were as pivotal as any physical or tactical skill, and that the forest, the ridge, and even Kael's shadowed guidance were components of a trial I had not fully comprehended. And then, as if on cue with the rising tension, the Alpha stopped abruptly, turning toward a narrow passage veiled in mist, a silent command in his posture, and I understood that the next stage of the trial would demand decisions I could not yet predict, that the stability of trust, the persistence of hope, and the balance of perception would all be tested simultaneously, and that Kael's presence, glowing red eye fixed on us, was both reassurance and warning, a signal that separation, uncertainty, and suspense were imminent, that the forest, the paths, and the unseen forces were conspiring to challenge not only skill but heart and intuition. With a deep breath, I took the step forward, aware that the trail ahead could divide us, that clarity might be delayed, and that what lay beyond the misted path could alter everything I thought I knew about the Alpha, the pack, and myself, leaving me suspended in a tension so sharp it almost cut through the very air. And as the shadow of Kael disappeared briefly into the veil, I felt the fragile weight of the moment pressing on me, knowing that trust would be tested, hope could fade, and the forest would demand more than I had yet given, leaving me standing at the edge of uncertainty, heart racing, senses alert, and the suspense of what would follow hanging over us like the thick, unbroken silence of the valley below. The forest trembled with an almost imperceptible hum as the sun dipped low behind the distant peaks, casting long, fractured shadows across the clearing where the Alpha had led me, and I felt the tension in the air coil tight around my chest, each breath shallow, each heartbeat a drum counting down to a confrontation I had sensed but never imagined would feel so immediate, so visceral. The Alpha stood before me, posture deliberate, eyes darkened with an intensity one could not read fully, his presence both challenge and invitation, and I realized that every subtle test, every cryptic signal Kael had left in the days before, had led to this singular moment, where trust, intuition, courage, and awareness would collide in ways I could neither anticipate nor control, and that the choices I made here would ripple beyond the clearing, beyond the forest, shaping destinies hidden from sight. Kael moved among the shadows as silently as a whisper, a black streak against the darkening foliage, his red eye glowing faintly, marking unseen patterns, leaving subtle signs for me to notice only if I was fully present, and I could feel the weight of his attention as though it pressed against my back and shoulders, reminding me that every action, every hesitation, and every glance was being observed by a presence older, wiser, and more enigmatic than either of us, a presence whose cryptic guidance had been shaping my awareness for days, preparing me for the choices that now demanded immediacy. The Alpha's voice, low and measured, finally broke the silence, issuing a challenge that was both literal and unspoken, a test of judgment, trust, and emotional fortitude, and I realized that the confrontation was not about conflict in the ordinary sense, but about revealing truths, acknowledging fears, and stepping into roles that destiny demanded, roles intertwined with forces older and more complex than my mind could yet comprehend. And I felt the forest itself respond, the wind stirring in sudden bursts, shadows twisting unnaturally, as if bearing witness to the unspoken stakes pressing down on the clearing. Kael's red eye flashed briefly from a perch atop a nearby boulder, drawing my gaze to the subtle shift in the Alpha's expression, a hint of hesitation, a flicker of vulnerability that could only be perceived by those paying attention, and I realized that Kael's presence was not merely observation, it was intervention in the form of guidance, a quiet shaping of awareness designed to sharpen instincts and ensure that the confrontation unfolded with both precision and consequence, that the stakes were understood and internalized before action was taken. I stepped forward, heart hammering, every sense alert, noting the slight tremor in the Alpha's hand, the way the light played against his features, the subtle tension in his shoulders, and I understood that this moment required clarity, a willingness to act with both caution and courage, to navigate the delicate balance between trust and intuition, and to confront the reality that some revelations demanded immediate recognition, even if the full picture remained obscured. The air seemed to thrum with anticipation, a chorus of invisible forces pressing upon us, insisting on attentiveness and engagement, and I felt the weight of choice settle over me like a tangible presence, guiding my movements and focus with a precision I had never before experienced. As I advanced, the clearing seemed to stretch, the shadows deepening and folding over themselves, and I caught Kael's subtle movement, a slight shift in posture, the faint brush of his tail along a branch, signaling both caution and direction, and I understood that even in the height of confrontation, the rogue wolf of secrets held a hand in the outcome, shaping events with minimal interference but maximum influence, guiding perception, attention, and response without overtly altering the course, a silent conductor orchestrating the tension. The Alpha's gaze met mine squarely, his eyes reflecting both the storm of emotion he carried and the weight of expectation he imposed, and in that gaze, I saw the collision of past mistakes, hidden truths, and the untested potential of trust that could either save or unravel us. And I felt the pull of destiny threading through my own spine, tugging me forward while whispering warnings of misstep, hesitation, and consequence. In a heartbeat, the confrontation escalated. Subtle cues in posture, microgestures, and the rhythm of breath became the language of challenge, the medium through which understanding and trust were tested, and I realized that the Alpha's intent was not conflict but revelation, to provoke recognition of strength, awareness, and clarity, and that Kael's presence ensured I would perceive the nuances critical to navigating the encounter successfully, highlighting hidden motives, concealed truths, and emotional currents invisible to all but the most observant. The forest seemed to lean in, every sound amplified. The rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot, the faint whistle of wind threading through branches, and I felt the confrontation deepen, my pulse sinking with the unspoken cadence of risk and revelation, and in the subtle interplay of shadow, light, and perception, I sensed a moment of truth approaching, the fulcrum upon which understanding and choice would pivot, shaping not only this encounter but the events that lay beyond the ridge, beyond the clearing, and into the unknown currents of destiny. Then, in the space between inhalation and exhalation, the Alpha moved toward a small, ancient formation of stones, their placement deliberate, purposeful, and resonant with hidden significance. And I understood that the confrontation was about to reach a decisive point, where choice, recognition, and courage would dictate the next phase, where the unseen threads Kael had highlighted would be tested in ways that demanded full attention and clarity, where hesitation could result in separation or revelation, and where the forest itself seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the outcome. Kael stepped forward onto a low branch, red eye flaring sharply against the dimming light, as though marking the precise moment of consequence, and I felt the weight of his gaze pierce my awareness, urging focus, readiness, and decisive action, a reminder that the confrontation was as much internal as external, a test of perception, courage, and the willingness to step into truth even when clarity remained partial, incomplete, and frightening. And just as the Alpha reached the center of the stones, raising his hand in a silent signal that the next action would determine revelation, protection, or loss, the forest shifted with a sudden intensity. The wind howled through the trees, shadows folded unnaturally, and Kael's red eye flared like a beacon of warning, leaving me frozen in the moment, heart racing, senses taut, aware that what came next would change everything I had known, understood, or trusted, and that the cliff between certainty and the unknown had been crossed, leaving the outcome suspended in the air, unresolved, cinematic, and charged with the promise of revelation, danger, and destiny yet to be fulfilled. The valley below was bathed in the molten gold of dawn, mist curling like smoke over the treetops, and I felt the culmination of every choice, every secret, every silent observation, pressing down with the weight of inevitability as though the forest itself had conspired to bring me to this precipice, where the truths I had sought collided with destinies I had never imagined and emotions I had barely allowed myself to feel. The Alpha stood before me, calm but raw, every measured gesture, every nuanced expression a mirror of the storms and sacrifices that had shaped him, and I understood that this moment was not merely confrontation or revelation, but the apex of connection, responsibility, and understanding, where the bonds we had forged were stretched across the expanse of trust, hope, and destiny, and where the choices I would make or fail to make would ripple far beyond the clearing, threading through the pack, the forest, and the hidden forces we had only begun to perceive. Kael emerged silently from the edge of the trees, red eye glinting with a depth that felt almost alive, his presence both sentinel and guide, and I felt the familiar shiver of recognition and tension, knowing that his cryptic interventions had brought us here, that his understanding of what was at stake went far beyond the visible, tangible events, and that when he spoke, it would carry the weight of insight few could grasp. His low, measured voice finally broke the quiet, startling in its clarity yet still cryptic. The path you choose will echo where even shadows dare not tread. And I felt the words embed themselves deep within me, a puzzle of caution, revelation, and preparation, urging attention and courage, and reminding me that Kael's role was as much about shaping perception as action, about teaching me to see what lay hidden in the folds of fate. The Alpha's gaze held mine, and in that moment, the air between us seemed to pulse with unspoken emotion, a rhythm built of trust, longing, fear, and awe, and I realized that the journey had not only tested perception and courage but had stripped away the layers of hesitation, forcing clarity of heart and mind, exposing truths that could no longer be ignored. I saw the weight of responsibility in his posture, the depth of vulnerability in his eyes, and I understood that the strength of leadership and love were intertwined, inseparable, and demanding of sacrifice, even when that sacrifice was subtle, internal, and unseen by others. I stepped closer, each movement deliberate, each breath measured, attuned to the cadence of the forest, to the silent signals Kael had left along the path, and to the currents of emotion and destiny pulsing between myself and the Alpha, aware that the choice I made in the next heartbeat would define not only the relationship we shared but the unfolding of forces beyond comprehension, shaping the pack, the forest, and the hidden threads Kael had so carefully guided me to notice. The Wind shifted suddenly, carrying a fragrance of moss, rain, and distant flowers, and I felt a tremor in the clearing, subtle yet undeniable, as though nature itself were aligning with the emotional and spiritual climax, echoing the internal surge of understanding and courage that had built within me, the recognition that transformation was not given freely but claimed through attention, awareness, and willingness to act, to embrace responsibility even when the cost was invisible and deeply personal. The Alpha reached toward me, hand extended, and I hesitated only briefly before taking it, feeling the connection spark like an unspoken promise, a bond forged through trials, revelations, and the quiet endurance of uncertainty, and I sensed that this act, though small in motion, carried the magnitude of affirmation, acceptance, and shared destiny, a subtle yet profound sacrifice of pride, fear, and doubt, leaving me more aware, attuned, and integrated with the currents that Kael had prepared me to navigate. Kael's presence remained at the periphery, red eye fixed on the exchange, and I felt the silent acknowledgement that his role was shifting, that the guidance he had offered in cryptic, indirect ways was now culminating, the lessons embedded in observation and patience crystallizing into clarity, and I understood that his cryptic line was not merely warning but preparation, a key to perceiving the deeper truths of connection, responsibility, and destiny, a reminder that transformation often required acceptance of challenge and the quiet courage to endure beyond the visible. Shadows lengthened as the sun rose fully, illuminating the forest and valley in warm, shifting light, and I felt an internal change, a subtle transformation in my own perception, heart, and mind, as if the trials, revelations, and confrontations had forged an understanding and resilience I had never possessed before, leaving me both humbled and empowered, aware that the sacrifices demanded were sometimes quiet, invisible, and internal, yet no less significant for their subtlety. The Alpha's expression softened, a combination of relief, recognition, and unspoken gratitude passing between us, and I understood that this emotional apex was not merely a personal triumph but a recalibration of trust, loyalty, and perception, a confirmation that the bonds between us, shaped by trials, observation, and shared courage, had reached a depth that would guide us through the unknown challenges yet to come. Kael's red eye flared one final time as he retreated into the shadows, leaving me with the echo of his line and the resonance of his presence, and in that instant, I realized that the transformation I felt was not complete, that the sacrifices made were only the first step toward alignment with forces beyond comprehension, and that the emotional peak was both culmination and prelude, a moment of clarity and profound tension, preparing me for what lay ahead while leaving the final consequences unresolved, the path forward charged with possibility, revelation, and the subtle, irrevocable shift of destiny in motion. The forest was calm, bathed in the soft glow of sunrise spilling through the trees, mist curling lazily over the valley as though hesitant to leave the world it had silently witnessed, and I felt a quiet weight lift from my chest, the tension of the past days giving way to a delicate balance of understanding, trust, and the intertwined threads of destiny that had guided every choice, every observation, and every revelation, leaving me breathless in awe at the complexity and beauty of the journey that had led us here. The Alpha stood beside me, the morning light catching the strength and warmth in his features, the intensity of past trials softened into a steady calm, a presence both protective and grounding, and I realized that what had been tested, strained, and questioned in the shadows of uncertainty, had now solidified into a bond forged through courage, empathy, and shared revelation. Unspoken yet undeniably powerful, Kael appeared at the edge of the clearing, emerging from the shadowed underbrush like a living silhouette against the soft gold light, his red eye catching the dawn momentarily before he retreated to the fringe, and I felt his presence as both acknowledgement and farewell, a silent reminder that though his interventions had guided, warned, and shaped us, the forest, the pack, and our destinies were now ours to carry forward, the lessons of perception, vigilance, and subtle understanding embedded within every fiber of our awareness. His low, almost imperceptible growl, or perhaps a word carried on the wind, seemed to whisper, "Even in peace the currents never rest," leaving me both comforted and aware that life's mysteries, though resolved for the moment, always lingered beyond the horizon, waiting for the next step, the next revelation, the next challenge. The Alpha reached for my hand, a simple gesture weighted with unspoken promises, trust, and the acknowledgement of everything endured and understood between us, and I clasped it without hesitation, feeling the warmth, solidity, and quiet strength of a bond that had been tested through uncertainty, emotional storms, and the subtle influence of unseen forces, a bond now tempered and refined like steel and fire, resilient yet flexible, capable of withstanding whatever the world would bring, the forest itself seeming to lean in and echo the harmony of that moment, every leaf and shadow resonating with a calm that felt almost sacred. I breathed deeply, absorbing the quiet beauty, the delicate balance of nature and emotion, of revelation and understanding, and I felt my own heart settle into a rhythm that matched the forest's, each pulse a reminder of courage, connection, and the power of awareness, the knowledge that the choices we make, the care we take, and the truths we embrace create ripples that extend far beyond what the eye can see, shaping lives, destinies, and bonds in ways subtle yet profound. The mist lifted slowly from the valley below, revealing streams sparkling in the morning light and trees standing tall like silent witnesses to the events that had unfolded, and I felt a wave of gratitude and awe for the trials, guidance, and revelations that had brought clarity, for the courage it had demanded, and for the transformation I had undergone, not only as Luna, entrusted with the pack and the Alpha's trust, but as a soul now intimately attuned to perception, intuition, and the subtle currents of destiny that Kael had so carefully guided me to notice. Kael's shadow shifted again, gliding along the distant ridge before dissolving into the forest, and I sensed the faintest echo of a howl, distant yet resonant, a reminder that the world beyond our clearing remained alive with secrets, watchful eyes, and challenges yet unseen, and that though the immediate trials had resolved, the threads of story, mystery, and supernatural connection stretched on, like invisible lines threading through the forest, binding past, present, and future in a continuum of awareness, vigilance, and quiet wonder. The Alpha's gaze met mine one last time in that moment, steady and reassuring, a reflection of trust, shared understanding, and the deep emotional bond forged through trials, observation, and courage, and I realized that even as the sun rose fully, illuminating the forest in brilliant gold, every shadow, every whisper of wind, and every subtle movement around us was now part of the larger tapestry we had learned to read, interpret, and navigate, a world alive with both challenges and beauty, where trust, love, and destiny intertwined seamlessly. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension of past uncertainty leave my body, and felt a subtle, almost imperceptible sense of completion, a recognition that the journey through revelation, emotional growth, and confrontation had brought us not only to clarity but to a place of readiness, where every lesson, every test, and every cryptic signal from Kael had culminated in understanding, connection, and the calm assurance that for now we were aligned with the currents of fate, the pack, and the forest that had silently witnessed our trials. And then as the sunlight poured fully over the ridge and the valley below shimmered with the promise of day, Kael's distant form paused atop a rocky outcrop, his red eye catching the light one final time, a silent emblem of watchfulness, of lessons imparted, and of mysteries that remained just out of reach, and I turned to the Alpha, feeling the warmth of his presence, the weight of destiny shared, and the unspoken vow of protection, understanding, and connection, and together we stood at the edge of the clearing, hands entwined, hearts steady, gazes lifted toward the rising sun, witnessing the first golden rays illuminate not only the forest and valley but the profound, unbroken bond of pack, destiny, and the supernatural threads that had guided us to this moment, leaving me with a final unforgettable image of clarity, unity, and hope, the world at peace, yet alive with promise, as Kael's shadow faded into the morning light, a lasting emblem of secrets, guidance, and the enduring pulse of stories yet to come.